In my starting seminary class, there was a woman, let's call her Melissa, because as best I can recall, that was her name. And she was one of the most intelligent people on campus. She was the person that had already read everything that we were being assigned. She was so smart. But she had emerged from a crushingly conservative and repressed childhood in the non-instrumental Church of Christ, in which both her innate intelligence and her gender were counted as liabilities. But in the academically competitive environment at Vanderbilt, she was really finally free to flourish, to express herself, to read, and to fully be herself. But even there, Melissa had some real serious social issues. She had never had a date. She had virtually never had close friends, in part because of her oppressive religious background, but also, and there's no kind way to say this, but she was one of the single most unattractive people I have ever seen in my life. Her appearance also betrayed the fact that she had evidently just given up years before. But as sometimes happens in seminary, a miracle happened. She did meet a man, and I'm not sure how they met, but I asked what was going on when you would see her smiling, because none of us had ever seen her smile. And she got to a point where she was just smiling all the time. And I know how sexist it sounds to say this, but it made her look so much more attractive. She was just being transformed in this love relationship. So they decided that they were going to get married. And in between classes and casual conversations, she would, because she knew that I knew something about the Churches of Christ, and she would say, well, you know, we want to have champagne at the reception, but if we do, my parents are not going to come, and we want to have a piano in the service, but if I do, my family's not going to come. In spite of how happy she was and how liberated she was, her family maintained their dysfunctional worship of a petty God that judged you for things like instrumental music and champagne. Theirs is a religion that truly keeps therapists in business. I mean, there's, between the Catholic Church and the Churches of Christ, there's an awful lot of therapists that have nice 501 or nice retirement programs on the strength of that. But in spite of the family issues, they were going to get married as soon as that first grueling year of graduate school was over. The next fall, when we came back to class, I saw her in the hallway, and I shouted out, "How's married life going?" And she looked as if I had shot her. And she said, you haven't heard. So she took me by the hand and led me into a meeting room and said, yeah, they got married that second week of May when we had just finished our first year of school. They went to Florida on their honeymoon, spent their wedding night in a hotel room on the beach, and the next morning he volunteered to go get something for their breakfast, and he never came back. And it took hours because he'd gone out without his wallet or anything, just put some cash in his pocket. It took hours for her to find out that he had been killed, that he was just crossing the street from the hotel, and a truck whose brakes had gone out just ran over him and killed him. Faced with this horrifying news, I reached deep into my young minister's bag of tricks, and I quoted Romans chapter 8, verse 8, "We know that all things work together for the good, for those who love God." Now, I was just 23 years old. I'd only been a minister for a year. But honestly, I'll tell you right now, I knew better even then. Even then, I knew better than to say that. But you know, in a moment like that, I'm not sure if I was trying to minister to her overwhelming grief or if I was trying to reassure myself that I wasn't just wasting my time going to seminary in the first place. And you know what is always kind of behind that kind of language, and this is the weird thing, but I think this is the real issue. I felt some compulsion to defend God, that somehow God's role in the universe had to be given an apology. Now, I know that you guys know this, but you know, sometimes religious people mess up and actually watch our videos online. So for the sake of our more traditional religious viewers, allow me to make this statement of the obvious. Any God who needs to be defended is not much of a God. If you have to be the one to mount a defense or an apology for God's screw-ups, there's something wrong with God. Now, Melissa, when I said this, wept a little, but I have to tell you, she was the bigger person that day. She patiently explained to me that God didn't kill her husband and that nothing good was going to come from it. She came back to school that fall because she said she simply didn't know what else to do and thought that she needed to be around her friends, but clearly she didn't need to be around me that day. I trust that our other peers in grad school had been better and smarter than I was that day, but I have to tell you, I learned a lot. That was a real educational moment for me, and I'm glad that she was patient enough to straighten me out. Because folks, in life, things don't always work out. We live in a capricious universe, and I'm not saying that things happen randomly. There are laws of physics, there are predictable and logical interactions of chemistry, in evolutionary biology, in the formation and the destruction of stars. Even in a runaway truck, there was inertia, there was gravity, there was an internal combustion engine. But what there was not a puppet master in the clouds pulling the strings that made that truck's brakes go out just in time to kill Melissa's husband on his first full day as a married man. There is no meaning. There is no divine intent. There is no sacred plan that is working itself out in history. That event was just sad. It was horrifyingly sad. I mean, there's not a one of you that didn't feel it in your own gut, that you've never met this woman, and yet you feel viscerally sympathy because some of the things that happen in life are just that bad. The universe is not random, but it is capricious. That is, there is not a plan. Stuff just happens. It always has, and it always will. There may be a cause, but that doesn't mean that there's a reason. You see the difference? Religious people will tell themselves that God is in heaven and all is right with the world, and even non-religious people will firmly announce their personal belief that everything happens for a reason because they can't stand to think about it otherwise. We are afraid to allow ourselves to accept that we live in a universe where there are thousands of kids that are born HIV positive in a country that is defined by poverty and hunger and violence, while millions of others are born healthy to parents that are going to indulge their every need and desire. There isn't a reason for that. There's just isness. There is an isness to the universe. It just is. I wish that people who say that they love the Bible so much would love it a little bit less and read it a little bit more. I would be the first to confess that the book of Job that we heard from today is not easy to understand if you don't have the benefit of some good education to help you to get at when and where and why it was written and what the intrusions are. It's a piece of ancient philosophy, originally written as Hebrew poetry, and at moments it is brilliant, but it doesn't yield itself to a facile reading. At its core, there is a narrative about a man who has suffered unspeakable tragedies. His children have been killed by marauding foreigners. His crops have died. His flocks have been stolen. And his own health suddenly deteriorates to a point that he's left just sitting in the dust with a broken piece of pottery scraping the boils on his skin. Now, that's how the book really begins. That whole betting thing between God and the devil, that's baloney that was added 500 years later. The poem begins with a man who has lost everything. And he shakes his fist at heaven and he demands an answer. That's the text that you heard Sean read so dramatically. If only I could interrogate God and get a good answer to why these horrible things have happened. Why did this happen to me? Well, in the unfolding of the poem, three of his friends, interlocutors, we call them in terms of philosophy, characters who represented a position, show up to comfort him. The text says they came to comfort him, but it's sort of like me telling Melissa that all things work together for the good of those who love God. It becomes evident that they're not really there to comfort Job. They are primarily there to comfort themselves. And like many of us who feel that we are ordained to speak spiritual truths, they insisted that God is good, that God is in charge, and that all of these things are happening for a good reason. His friends told him that there was a divine plan, a reason that is just beyond his ability to understand, that God's ways are beyond us, they are above us. And when all of that argument failed, they came around to a different argument, saying that he was surely being punished for some sin, though none of them could think of any sin that Job had committed. And Job says, what a lot of us would say, well, I'm not a saint, I'm not perfect, but I sure haven't done anything that deserved this. It's odd to me how many evangelicals accept that God had to kill his own son to redeem them for their sins. And I keep thinking, well, what did you do? I mean, I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes, but I think I could get by on a fine. I don't think anybody has to die for any of the things that I've done. So this goes on and on for hours, and 40 chapters, if you want to take it more literally. And then in the end, somehow God actually does show up. God shows up to answer the charge. But the answer is, I got to tell you, it's entirely unsatisfactory. It does go on a bit, but by and large, it's little more than a statement of the fact that the universe is huge, it's complex, and it's incomprehensible, which is to say, not just that the truth is beyond your ability to comprehend or you can't handle the truth. The truth is in the isness of the universe. It just is. And it doesn't have to mean anything. It just is. Now, truly inferior hands tried to make additions to Job through the centuries to make it all make a little bit more sense, or to offer more of a defense for God. It isn't hard to see most of the additions. The original text is written in Hebrew poetry, and the secondary hands are written in prose. So you can look at your Bible and see where the different parts are there. I won't even dignify that gambling at the beginning. I won't dignify that with any further comment. But at the end, after the verses of chapter 42, you can ignore all of the endings, but there is in God's appearance, there is a mildly satisfying gesture. When God tells the friends of Job that they were all wrong, that their religious gyrations that they had been pillaring Job with for 40 chapters, God dismisses them and tells them that they need to go sacrifice 7 bulls and 7 rams just for saying stupid stuff. I mean, there's nothing more complicated in this text. I know that seems unlikely, but it's right there in chapter 42 of Job. I miss the good old days when you could give someone a hefty fine for saying stupid things about God. But it's somewhat comforting to me that it happened at least this once. Of course, it didn't happen, but, I don't know what the going price of 7 bulls and 7 rams is, but that's That's not a small fine. And it's just for being stupid. It is not more complicated than that. Religious people have used supernatural theism as a way of abdicating any moral responsibility for what happens in the world. As Scott Peck observed, a hurricane is not an act of God. It's an accident of nature. However, when volunteers will come from hundreds of miles away to help clean up and to rebuild, to open their wallets and checkbooks, to donate to the victims of disaster, I'm willing to give you the license to say that is an act of God, because it is certainly an act of loving compassion. And how much closer can you get to God than that? I mean, really. Hurricanes come, I'm not going to wander into meteorology. I would get lost right away, but it's not religious. God is not pulling the strings above the clouds, healing one child's cancer while at the same time sending a truck careening out of control to kill Melissa's husband. Now, you may think that I'm excessively cynical, and you might not be wrong if you think that, but there is no one in charge of the universe. There's no reason why things have to happen the way that they do. But I'm not the first person to say this. I'm not just some 21st century agnostic in a pulpit that says this. St. Teresa of Avila said, "Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on the world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands. Yours are the feet. Yours are the eyes. You are his body. Christ has no body now on earth but yours." I'm not saying that I believe in determinism. The world is not just a bunch of chemicals and forces of physics that have been set in motion, and we have no will to change the course of events. If you decide that you're going to smoke cigarettes, you need to recognize that is a causative cancer of lung cancer and bad breath. Sugar consumption. I have a cake infection that I recognize this is not accidental. People don't come out of concentration camps fat. This is the result of bad decision making. Driving while drunk has lethal consequences. Our choices do matter. Take this kid, for example. Now, he's going places. Not Princeton, not Yale, but places. Because our choices have consequences, and some choices are better than others. We are not big biblicists here in this church, even though that is the heritage of most of us. What the churches of our youth failed to point out to us is that the Bible really doesn't have just one worldview. It doesn't have just one theological perspective. There are passages written by people who do believe that God is a puppet master who lives in the clouds. There are parts of the Bible that assure readers that God is in charge, that things happen according to God's divine plan, that God answers prayers, God will heal us, protect us, God will find us jobs, God will even find you a parking place at the mall during the Christmas season. But then there's the book of Job. And good old Job stands up in the middle of the Old Testament to say, it just ain't so. Kind of like the religious horizon in our area, it might even be fair to say that most of the Bible echoes Paul's insistence that all things work together for the good of those who love God. Even AIDS babies in Africa, or war refugees out of Syria, or the toddlers that we put in prison on the American border with Mexico. Most of the Bible sings with the psalmist that God is our protector, our defender, our savior, and deliverer. And some people who have heard me disparage the notion of God as being a 12-month out of the year Santa Claus who grants all of our wishes if we really, really, really believe in fairies, they will say to me, how do you know? How can you be so sure that it isn't so? And honestly, The only way I know is exactly the same way I know that there is no Santa Claus, that there is no tooth fairy, and there is no Easter bunny. Now, I could be wrong about all those things. It's just that there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that I'm wrong. As, wasn't it you, Bob, who told me your professor said, this is just my opinion, I just happen to be right? In the same way, Job and a lot of the Proverbs and most of Ecclesiastes offers in the Bible a minority opinion, in the same way that our church offers an alternative view of reality here. We're kind of like Job and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. We may be the minority view. It's just apparent that we're more oriented to reality than the rest of the religious world. I understand why people are attracted to magical thinking. It is comforting in a way. It just ain't so. A healthy spirituality can never be achieved through any kind of denial of reality. The mysterious spirit of the universe that seems to be in all places and a part of all things, that spirit doesn't feed the hungry. It doesn't heal the sick. It doesn't visit the imprisoned, clothe the naked, or welcome the stranger. That's our job. That is the part of being the hands and feet of God. It is, as St. Teresa said, only through our eyes that God looks compassion into the world. That's not a lack of religious faith, and it's not caving into cynicism. It's an orientation to reality that I wish we could share with every one of our sister congregations, because since it is true that God has no hands but our hands, no feet but our feet, no eyes but our eyes, it sure would be helpful if they would get off their asses and go to work with us. That's what I think.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.